The snow was falling in slow, delicate flakes, each one landing softly against the warmth of my skin that was quickly fading away. My breath came out in short white clouds, my fingers too numb to even move. I tilted my head back toward the night sky. The moon, a lone silver coin, casted its light over the courtyard, turning the world into something almost beautiful, if not for the iron gates closing behind me. I had been a servant in the Duke's household since I was a child, loyal to a fault, careful to avoid mistakes. But loyalty meant nothing when Rose pointed her manicured finger at me and accused me of stealing from the Duke's treasury. I tried to speak, to explain, but my voice was drowned by the whispers of the nobles gathered in the hall. They looked at me as if I was dirt beneath their boots. The Duke, Henry, never met my eyes. His decision was swift. Cast out immediately, with no chance to defend myself. I stumbled into the freezing night without a coat, the snow soaking my thin shoes, my tears freezing before they could fall. I could still see Rose standing in the doorway, her lips curved in a small, satisfied smile. By morning, I was nothing but a pale, cold body lying in the drift outside the servants' gate. But death did not hold me. I woke with a violent gasp, clutching my chest, my heart pounding in a room I knew too well. My old narrow bed, the crooked wooden chair in the corner, the small frost-speckled window overlooking the stables. The air was warmer, and I could hear the distant clatter of the kitchen staff preparing breakfast. I sat up, my hands trembling. It was the same winter, but the snow outside had not yet swallowed the earth. I had been thrown out in late January, which meant I had weeks before it happened. Weeks, and every cursed memory of what would come. I remembered the exact route the Duke's trade caravans would take, the affairs hidden behind closed doors, the bribes tucked into velvet purses, the petty feuds that would soon turn into scandals. And I remembered every single lie Rose had told to destroy me. This time I would not wait for them to tighten the noose. I would pull the rope myself. I kept my expression calm as I went about my morning tasks. My hands moved over the wooden table, polishing silverware for the Duke's dinner service, while my mind replayed the years of secrets I had witnessed. Countess Elise, with her endless gambling debts. Victor, the Duke's cousin, whose marriage would soon collapse when his fiancée learned of his mistress. Henry's hidden dealings with smugglers in the southern ports. All of it, carefully locked away in my mind, until now. I had been too afraid to use any of it before. But fear had already killed me once. I learned quickly that the smallest shift in behavior could cause suspicion. Instead of avoiding eye contact with the other servants, I met their gaze evenly. Instead of shrinking in Rose's presence, I let my eyes linger on her a second longer than necessary, just enough to make her frown. I started positioning myself near conversations I knew would matter later. Offering to serve tea in the Duke's study when Victor visited, or taking the longer route through the East Wing where Elise liked to gossip behind her fan. The first night, lying in my narrow bed, I whispered each secret I knew into the dark as if reciting a prayer. I wanted them etched into my memory in perfect detail. I would need proof eventually, letters, ledgers, witnesses, but for now, planting the first seeds was enough. Rose would not see me coming. She believed I was still the meek little servant she could destroy with a single accusation. Let her think that. The snow would still fall in a few weeks, but this time I would be the one standing in the warmth, watching her shiver. The day began with a thin layer of frost glazing the courtyard stones, the kind of morning that made servants move slower, hunched over their work. I moved quickly, but not from fear of punishment. I was eager, my mind sharpening with every step I took toward the kitchens. Today I would start gathering the proof I needed. In my first life, I had stumbled upon Countess Elise's debt ledger by accident when delivering wine to the library. I remembered the exact shelf, the precise corner where she carelessly tucked it between books. That book was my first target. But to get there without raising suspicion, I needed to maneuver myself into errands that would take me near the library. The opportunity came sooner than I expected when the steward complained about a missing order list for the Duke's evening wine. I offered to search, pretending to be flustered at the thought of being blamed. He waved me off impatiently, telling me to look anywhere it might have been misplaced. I took the side staircases to avoid the main hall, slipping into the library when no one was watching. The room smelled of old paper and dust, the sunlight catching floating specks in the air. I headed straight to the shelf I remembered, my fingers brushing past volumes of trade records until they closed over a slim, leather-bound book. I opened it just enough to see the columns of numbers, names of creditors, and Elise's shaky signature. Perfect. I slid it into the pocket of my apron, already planning how to use it. I could destroy her with this, but it was too soon. Instead, I would make her bleed slowly, leaking her shame in whispers until her position crumbled. As I left the library, I nearly collided with Liam, the guard I had ignored in my past life. He steadied me, his hand firm on my arm. His eyes were sharp, taking in the fact that I was in a part of the house where servants rarely lingered. "Lost?" he asked. I forced a small laugh, letting my cheeks flush as if embarrassed. "Looking for a missing order list." His gaze held mine for a moment before he stepped aside. "Be careful. People notice things." I tucked that warning away. In my first life, Liam never noticed me. Now, it seemed he might be paying closer attention. That could be dangerous, or useful. By midday, the book was hidden under a loose floorboard in the laundry room, a place only I dared clean because of the dust. Rose swept into the kitchens later, her perfume arriving before she did. She asked for a tray of tea to be sent to the Duke's study and made sure I was the one to deliver it. In the past, this would have made me anxious. Now, I saw it for what it was, a test. She wanted to see if I would falter in Henry's presence. I didn't. I carried the tray in with steady hands, placing it on the low table by his chair. Henry barely glanced at me, engrossed in a letter. But Victor was there, leaning casually against the fireplace, his sharp gaze following my movements. "Leave it there," Henry said. I bowed slightly and turned to go, catching Victor's smirk as I passed. They were discussing trade agreements with southern merchants, and I caught enough of their conversation to confirm Henry was already involved in illicit shipments. That would be important later. By the time I returned to the servants' quarters, I had decided my next move. I would start a rumor about Elise's debts, small enough to be dismissed as idle talk but true enough to take root. And I would find a way to keep crossing paths with Liam. In a palace like this, survival meant having someone in armor on your side, and secrets sharp enough to cut through any lie. The rumor about Elise began like all dangerous truths do, quietly, in the corners where the servants whispered while peeling vegetables or sweeping corridors. I let it slip to a maid who adored gossip but could never keep it contained. I told her in a hushed tone that I had seen a courier from a moneylender leave the countess's chambers with a heavy purse and a worried expression. By evening, 2 kitchen boys were already arguing over how much debt Elise could be hiding. The beauty of it was that I never needed to repeat it, the palace would do the work for me. While that seed was growing, I turned my attention to Liam. He was stationed near the east wing that week, guarding the Duke's private offices. In my first life, I had only passed him briefly, never exchanging more than a nod. Now I lingered when I crossed his post, offering small bits of conversation. I spoke about things a servant might notice, how the snow was coming early, how the storerooms were filling with imported goods. Each time, I gauged his reactions, planting small hints that I knew more than I should. On the 3rd day, he surprised me by asking, "Why were you near the library the other morning?" I smiled faintly, keeping my tone light. "I told you, looking for the missing list. I thought I might have misplaced it there." He didn't press, but the way he looked at me told me he knew I was lying. I decided not to push him further yet. Trust, like revenge, was best built slowly. Meanwhile, I began weaving myself into conversations with the palace staff who worked closest to the Duke and his circle. The key was to offer something of value without revealing my true hand. When the steward needed someone to deliver a sealed message to Victor, I volunteered. It meant passing through the Duke's meeting chamber, where I heard Victor negotiating shipping rights with a minor lord. I caught a name, Captain Royce, that I knew from my first life would later be arrested for smuggling rare silks. I filed it away for later use. That night, in the servants' dormitory, I lay awake mapping the web I was building. Elise's debts were the first thread, and soon it would pull tighter around her until she was gasping for air. Liam's attention was the second, a potential shield if things turned violent. And Victor? Victor would need to be handled carefully. In my first life, I had underestimated him. This time, I knew he was far more dangerous than his charming smirk suggested. 2 days later, my plan with Elise took its first satisfying turn. She stormed into the kitchens, demanding to know who had been speaking about her finances. Her cheeks were flushed, her voice trembling with fury, and the servants avoided her gaze. I stood at the back, silent, knowing she would never suspect me. But her outburst confirmed something important: she was already feeling the pressure. I slipped away before she could see my smile. Outside, snowflakes began to fall, soft and harmless for now. But I knew how quickly they could become a storm. This time, I would be the one to decide who froze. Elise's panic was only the beginning. I knew she would try to smother the rumor, but in doing so, she would draw more attention to herself. The next step was to make sure the right ears heard it, the ones with enough influence to turn idle talk into scandal. That meant getting close to the women who controlled the social calendar of the palace. In my first life, I had scrubbed their boots and poured their wine without realizing how much power they held. Now I understood. If they whispered a name with disdain, that name would be unwelcome at every ball and private gathering within weeks. I timed my errands so I could be in the antechamber when Lady Caraway visited Rose. Lady Caraway loved nothing more than to flaunt her connections, and she had a habit of arriving early to eavesdrop herself. I carried in a tray of tea and pretended to tidy the mantel while she lingered near the door, listening for gossip. In a voice pitched just loud enough for her to hear, I mentioned to another servant that Elise had been avoiding the gaming tables lately, unusual for her, and that a moneylender's man had been seen at her door. I didn't look at Lady Caraway, but I knew she was listening. By the next morning, Elise's debts were being discussed in the Duke's own drawing room. I heard it myself when I was sent to clear the tea service. Rose was pouring cups for Henry and Victor, her tone sharp as she said, "It's a shame when someone of her station can't manage her affairs." Henry barely looked up, but Victor's eyes narrowed in a way that told me he was making a note of it. The chain was working exactly as I had planned. While that thread tightened, I started gathering material on Rose herself. It wasn't enough to know she had framed me. I needed proof and a way to ruin her without implicating myself. I remembered a winter gala from my first life, where Rose had slipped away with a visiting lord while his wife was still in attendance. There had been whispers after, but no one dared confront her because she held too many favors over too many people. This time, I would make sure those whispers became shouts. I began shadowing her movements whenever I could, watching for moments where she let her guard down. On the 4th day of watching, I caught her in the west corridor speaking with the same lord from that memory. He was leaning too close, his hand brushing hers before she stepped back. It was fleeting, but enough to start the outline of a scandal. Liam saw me as I rounded the corner, his brows drawing together. "You're in the wrong wing again," he said quietly. I shrugged, letting my lips curl in the faintest smile. "I get lost easily." He studied me for a moment before saying, "No, you don't." That told me two things: he was paying closer attention than I'd hoped, and he was starting to realize I was playing a game. Whether he would join me or stop me was still uncertain. That night, I sat by the frost-lined window in my narrow room and watched the snow fall heavier, each flake disappearing into the darkness. The courtyard looked just as it had on the night I died. But this time, I wasn't afraid of it. This time, the cold was mine to wield. Soon, it would bite at the ones who had left me there. The palace was buzzing in a way I hadn't heard since my first life, and this time I was the one who had set it humming. Elise had begun avoiding public gatherings altogether, claiming illness, which only fueled the gossip. Rose was busy trying to keep the Duke's attention fixed on her, unaware that I was slowly working to pull her footing out from under her. But the next stage of my plan required a more delicate touch. I needed an ally inside the noble ranks, someone powerful enough to open doors I could never enter as a servant, but ambitious enough to strike a deal with me. That someone was Victor. In my first life, he had been a distant figure, more concerned with his own wealth than the petty affairs of servants. But I knew his weakness now, his thirst for control over the Duke's trade empire. And I knew of a scandal that could help him get it. To approach him, I needed to catch him somewhere private, somewhere his guards would not linger. I waited until he visited the stables to inspect a new shipment of horses. While he examined the animals, I slipped in with a bucket, pretending to be on my usual cleaning rounds. He glanced at me only briefly before turning back to the horses, but I spoke before he could leave. "Captain Royce is making deals behind your back," I said quietly, keeping my head bowed. He froze, his hand stilling on the reins of a dark bay. "What did you say?" I straightened just enough to meet his eyes. "I heard him in the East Hall last night. Talking about selling southern goods without reporting them to you. The Duke knows. He's letting it happen." It was a calculated risk, giving him that piece of truth so openly. Victor studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he asked, "Why tell me?" I let a hint of bitterness color my voice. "Because the people here use loyalty as a leash. I'd rather see them fight each other than pull me down with them." A slow smile spread across his face. "Interesting. He didn't ask my name. He didn't need to." From that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between us. He would not expose me, and I would feed him the pieces that suited his ambition. That afternoon, I tested his discretion by slipping him another morsel, a mention of Elise's debts. His lips twitched, and I knew he was already thinking of ways to use it against her and the Duke both. Meanwhile, Liam had grown more curious. He intercepted me outside the laundry room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "You're making a lot of trips to places you don't belong," he said. "Careful. The last servant who wandered like that disappeared." I looked at him steadily. Maybe they weren't careful enough. His jaw tightened, but he stepped aside to let me pass. I didn't miss the flicker of something in his eyes, not quite warning, not quite approval. That night, the snow came heavier, piling against the windowsills. I lay in bed with my eyes open, replaying every conversation, every glance, every seed I had planted. Elise was already weakening. Rose was still secure, but cracks had begun to form. And now I had Victor watching for my signal. Soon, the web would be tight enough that a single tug would bring it all crashing down. And when it did, I would be the only one left standing in the warmth while they scrambled in the cold. The next morning, the palace corridors were restless with the sound of quiet plotting. It was the kind of day where smiles were forced and conversations cut short when footsteps echoed too close. My work was starting to show. Elise had not left her chambers in 3 days, sending only curt notes to cancel her appearances. Rose, still oblivious to the net I was spinning, was in a brighter mood, believing Elise's absence meant she had won some unspoken competition for influence. But victory in the palace was never a straight line, it was a slow bleed, and I was the one holding the knife. Today, I intended to make that cut deeper. I rose earlier than usual, before the kitchens were fully awake, and took the chance to move through the East Wing where the Duke kept his private correspondence. In my first life, I had been too afraid to touch the drawers in his study, but now I knew exactly which one held the letters I needed. The desk was locked, but the key was always left in a small ceramic vase on the shelf, Henry's carelessness born from arrogance. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned the key and pulled out a stack of letters bound with black ribbon. I scanned quickly, searching for the names and places I remembered. There it was. A letter from a merchant in the southern ports, discussing a shipment of silks and spices brought in without tariffs, the kind of illegal trade that could tarnish Henry's standing if the right nobles heard of it. I tucked the letter back with the others, careful to leave no trace of my visit. It wasn't time to use this yet, but it would become the blade at Henry's throat when I needed it. When I left the study, Liam was leaning against the wall outside. He didn't ask why I was there. He just gave me a look that made my pulse slow in wary caution. "You've been walking into dangerous rooms, Clara," he said evenly. "One day you won't walk out." I met his eyes and answered without hesitation. "Not if I'm the one holding the door." His gaze lingered on me, something unreadable in his expression, before he stepped aside. His warning was real, but so was his reluctance to stop me. That was enough for now. By midday, I had orchestrated another meeting with Victor. I waited in the shadow of the stable, knowing he would arrive to inspect a shipment of grain that was being offloaded from a cart. When he stepped inside, I moved to his side without drawing attention. "Elise is drowning," I murmured. "But Rose is still untouched." Victor tilted his head slightly, his smirk faint. "And you want her touched?" I didn't deny it. "She framed me for theft. She'll do it again if I let her. But I know something about her that you could use." He studied me with interest, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. "What is it?" "Her affair with Lord Branton," I said quietly. "The one she thinks no one saw." His smirk widened. "Dangerous knowledge for a servant to hold." I shrugged. "Dangerous for her to keep." Victor leaned closer, his voice low. "Give me proof, and I'll make sure she falls hard enough that she can't get back up." Proof would mean catching her in the act or finding something tangible, a note, a gift, a witness. I already knew when she would meet him next. That winter gala in my first life had been the perfect setting for indiscretions, and I would make sure this life was no different. But the gala was still a week away. In the meantime, I could keep twisting the knife in Elise's side. That afternoon, I arranged for one of the kitchen boys to accidentally drop a note, and invented one, written in my hand but signed with the mark of a moneylender, near the main corridor where Lady Caraway would find it. It spoke of a large sum owed by Elise, overdue and subject to public notice if not paid. By evening, the palace was humming with renewed interest in her disgrace. From the balcony above the great hall, I watched Elise cross the marble floor, her head bowed, her pace quick. The murmurs followed her like a shadow, and I saw her hand tremble as she reached for the banister. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. And still, Rose didn't see the storm forming behind her own back. As night fell, I stood at my window, the snow drifting down in thick sheets, muffling the sounds of the palace. The courtyard below looked just as it had when I died, but instead of cold settling into my bones, there was a slow, burning heat in my chest. I had Elise tangled, Victor intrigued, Liam watching, and Henry unknowingly holding the weight of his own destruction in his study. Soon, the threads would pull tight. Soon, someone else would feel the cold bite of the snow, and this time I would be watching from inside, warm and untouchable. The snow had not stopped for 2 days, and the palace felt smaller, more enclosed, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It was the perfect atmosphere for quiet ruin. Elise's absence from public events had become the main source of conversation among the nobles, and I could see in the tightness of her face whenever she appeared that the whispers were starting to sink into her bones. But I couldn't let her collapse too quickly. She was a distraction that kept eyes away from my real target, Rose. The winter gala was approaching, and with it, the moment I had been waiting for since I woke up in this second life. In my first life, I had been serving wine in the East Gallery when I saw Rose slip away with Lord Branton. They disappeared into the music room, the door closing just enough to hide them from the crowd but not from me. I remembered the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air when she returned, her smile a little too bright. No one dared speak of it openly then. This time I would make sure everyone saw. I began with the groundwork. 3 days before the gala, I arranged for a loose floorboard in the music room to be repaired by a carpenter I trusted, a man whose sister owed me a favor. I instructed him to leave a narrow gap in the panel near the window, just large enough to see inside without being noticed. Then I made sure Victor knew exactly where Rose and Branton would be. I told him I'd seen them exchanging notes and that Branton would be alone in the music room at the height of the evening. I didn't tell him I planned to make sure Rose joined him. On the morning of the gala, the palace was a flurry of preparation. Servants rushed to polish the silver, arrange the flowers, and set out the wine. I kept my head down, doing my assigned tasks, but my mind was fixed on the trap I'd built. I caught sight of Liam twice during the day, his eyes lingering on me longer than they should have. Finally, as I carried a tray of crystal glasses through the hall, he stopped me. "I don't know what you're doing," he said quietly, "but I can feel the danger in it. Just, make sure you can live with it after." I held his gaze. "I've already lived with worse." He didn't reply, but his jaw tightened, and he stepped aside. By evening, the great hall glowed with candlelight, the air thick with perfume and the low hum of music from the string quartet. The guests danced and drank, their laughter echoing against the marble walls. I moved through them like smoke, unseen unless I wanted to be noticed. At the right moment, I approached Rose, carrying a goblet of wine. "Lord Branton is looking for you," I murmured. He said, "It's urgent." She raised a brow, curiosity flashing in her eyes. Without hesitation, she swept away toward the music room. I followed at a distance, circling to the outer corridor where the narrow gap in the panel waited. Through it, I saw her enter, saw Branton rise to greet her, and saw the way their hands lingered together far longer than propriety allowed. They spoke in low voices, but I didn't need to hear the words. The intimacy was in their smiles, in the way she leaned toward him. I stepped back, just as Victor arrived in the corridor with 2 other nobles in tow. "I think you'll want to see this," I heard him say. They looked through the gap, and the silence that followed was heavier than any shout. By the time Rose emerged, her face flushed and her composure cracking, the news was already spreading. The Duchess's lady-in-waiting caught sight of her and whispered into another's ear. It moved like fire through dry leaves, faster than even I expected. Rose noticed me once across the hall that night, and for the first time since I had returned, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't know what I had done or how, but she knew I had a hand in it. I returned to my quarters long after midnight, the sounds of the gala still drifting faintly through the halls. Outside, the snow was falling again, heavy and relentless. I stood at the window, watching it cover the courtyard, and thought of the night I had died there. In my first life, it had been my grave. In this one, it would be the stage where I watched my enemies freeze. The morning after the gala, the air in the palace was brittle with tension. Whispers clung to the walls like frost, and every passing glance was heavy with unspoken speculation. Rose did not leave her chambers until midday, and when she did, her head was held high but her steps were sharper, almost too precise, as though sheer willpower was the only thing keeping her from shattering. I followed her movements from the shadow of the corridor, noting the way she avoided Victor entirely and kept her eyes fixed on Henry. She was trying to secure her position before the whispers could take root deep enough to choke her. But the beauty of gossip was that once it was in bloom, it could not be pulled out without tearing the soil apart. My work, however, was not finished. The affair was only the first crack in her armor. The next strike would expose her role in my false accusation from my first life, but this time with proof so undeniable that even Henry could not shield her. That meant retrieving the ledger she had used to frame me, a forged book of treasury records she had planted in my quarters to make it look like I had been skimming funds. I remembered exactly where she kept the real version, hidden in a false bottom of her dressing table. The problem was that her rooms were guarded when she was absent and too full of eyes when she was present. I needed her distracted, and for that, I turned to Victor. I found him in the West Wing, speaking quietly with a merchant who owed him favors. I waited until they parted before stepping close enough for him to notice me. "She'll be in the rose garden after lunch," I said softly. "She always goes there when she's rattled." "And she is rattled?" His brow arched slightly, a silent question. "Keep her there for an hour," I added. "I'll make it worth your while." He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. We both understood the currency of this palace was leverage, and I was offering him a piece he could use later. True to my word, Rose drifted to the garden just after the midday meal, her cloak pulled tight against the cold. Victor intercepted her, drawing her into a conversation that looked cordial from a distance but, judging by the stiffness of her shoulders, was anything but. I slipped into her chambers while the corridor outside remained empty. The dressing table gleamed in the pale winter light, every brush and bottle perfectly arranged. I pulled out the bottom drawer and felt along the inside for the thin seam I knew was there. The false panel lifted with a faint scrape, revealing the ledger beneath. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open. Neat columns of figures, all accurate to the coin, until the page with my name. There, in Rose's handwriting, were the fabricated entries that had damned me in my first life. I slid the book into my apron and replaced everything exactly as it had been. By the time I returned to the servants' quarters, my heartbeat had slowed and my face was the picture of calm. That night, I took the ledger to a safe place, a narrow cavity behind the laundry room fireplace where heat never reached but prying hands would never think to search. I wasn't ready to reveal it yet. Timing was everything. If I played it too soon, Henry might bury the evidence before it did lasting damage. For now, it was enough to know I had it. Over the next 2 days, I watched Rose with quiet satisfaction. She was more careful now, less confident in her smiles, as if she could feel eyes on her even in empty corridors. Elise, meanwhile, had grown desperate, sending letters to friends who were suddenly too busy to reply. I heard from a scullery maid that Elise had begun selling jewelry to cover her debts. Perfect. It meant both of my distractions were fully occupied with their own unraveling. That freed me to set my sights higher, Henry himself. The letter about the smuggling from the southern ports was still tucked safely away in his study, but I didn't need the original to use it. All I needed was a copy, and I had the perfect scribe for the task. Liam. He caught me again that evening, leaning in the shadows near the servants' entrance as I returned from delivering wine to the upper floor. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said without preamble. I met his gaze steadily. "Then help me win it." His jaw flexed, but he didn't walk away. "What do you need?" I smiled faintly. "A faithful hand to copy a letter exactly as it is. No changes, no mistakes." His eyes narrowed. "And if I say no?" I stepped past him, close enough for my words to be for his ears alone. "Then you'll keep wondering what I'm doing until the day you find yourself on the wrong side of it." I didn't wait for his answer. I knew he'd follow. And when he did, the final threads of my web would be ready to pull tight. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, silent and relentless, coating the courtyard in white. Soon, I thought, someone else will be standing there in the cold, and this time, I'll be the one closing the gates. Liam agreed without another word, which told me more about him than a dozen conversations could have. We met in the servants' stairwell after midnight, where the walls muffled footsteps and the draft kept everyone else away. I handed him a small sheet of fine parchment, cut to the same size as the letter in Henry's study. "Every mark exactly as you see it," I whispered. He didn't ask what the letter contained, only gave a curt nod before slipping away toward the Duke's wing with the ease of someone who had long since learned how to be invisible in dangerous places. I waited in the laundry room, the cold seeping into my bones, until he returned less than half an hour later. The copy he handed me was perfect, every curve of the handwriting, every smudge of the ink, even the faint crease where the original had been folded. I folded the copy into a small envelope and sealed it with plain wax. This was the letter that would shatter Henry's carefully crafted image if it fell into the right hands. But it wasn't time to unleash it just yet. I had one more move to make first, and it would ensure my revenge hit all of them at once. The winter feast was approaching, a night when every noble in the region would gather under the Duke's roof, when music and wine would drown out suspicion until the moment truth was dropped like a stone into still water. That night, I would destroy Elise, Rose, and Henry in one unbroken chain. For Elise, I would make her debts undeniable. For Rose, I would make her betrayal public beyond repair. And for Henry, I would plant the seed of his downfall so deeply that even his most loyal allies would doubt him. I began by spreading word to the right servants, those who spoke to their masters in the quiet moments between courses, that Elise had been forced to sell a family heirloom to pay her debts. It wasn't a lie, I had seen her hand over the diamond brooch myself to a discreet jeweler in the city. I made sure that detail reached Lady Caraway, who would ensure it passed from ear to ear before the feast even began. For Rose, I still had the ledger that proved her guilt in framing me. That would not be handed to a noble in private. It would be slipped into Henry's own study the night of the feast, left in plain sight on his desk so that when he inevitably found it, he would know his most trusted companion had deceived him. And I would make certain he discovered it in front of Victor. As for Henry himself, the copied letter about his smuggling would be placed in the pocket of a particularly self-righteous marquis, one who prided himself on exposing corruption. He would believe he'd found it by accident, and from there, it would spread like fire. The day of the feast, the palace was a glittering trap. The great hall was draped in white and silver, crystal chandeliers blazing above, tables heavy with roasted meats and sugared fruits. The guests arrived in cloaks dusted with snow, their laughter echoing in the high ceilings. I moved unseen among them, pouring wine, adjusting tablecloths, my hands steady even as my pulse quickened with each step of my plan. I slipped the copied letter into the Marquis's coat as he left it unattended on a chair, my movement masked by a tray of champagne flutes. I left the ledger open on Henry's desk, the damning pages marked with a ribbon as if someone had been reading it moments before. And I lingered near Lady Caraway long enough to hear her telling a small group about Elisa's supposed desperation, her voice full of the thrill of knowing what others did not. As the evening wore on, I watched it happen. Elisa's face tightened as the nobles she approached made polite excuses to move away. Henry's brow furrowed when he returned to his study between courses, Victor at his side, and found the ledger. Rose was nowhere to be seen for several minutes after that. And across the hall, the Marquis was reading the letter with his lips pressed thin, already looking around for someone to share it with. By the time the first snow of the night began to fall outside, the feast had turned sharp and brittle, the air full of glances that cut like glass. I had not been called out. No one suspected the servant moving quietly among them with a tray and a faint, unreadable smile. The night was not yet over. But I could feel it. The moment where everything would tip was coming. And when it did, the cold that had once killed me would finally belong to them. The moment came like the crack of ice under too much weight, sudden, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The winter feast was at its height, the music swelling, laughter curling around the high vaulted ceiling, wine flowing as though the barrels would never run dry. But beneath the glitter and warmth, I could feel the tension shifting, threads pulling tighter, ready to snap. I was moving between tables with a tray of fresh goblets when the first fisher appeared. The Marquis who had found Henry's smuggling letter rose from his seat, the paper clutched in his hand, his face flushed with both wine and outrage. His voice carried easily over the music. "Duke Henry, would you care to explain why your signature appears on this agreement for untaxed goods entering our ports?" The musicians faltered, the notes dying in the air. Every head turned toward the Duke, whose expression went rigid as Victor's gaze locked on him. The Marquis continued, waving the paper for the nearby guests to see, already speaking of corruption and betrayal of the crown. Henry began to protest, his voice low and controlled, but the sight of Victor's thin smile told me the damage was already spreading. Before Henry could recover, the second blow landed. Lady Caraway, her voice pitched with false concern, stood near the dais and murmured to a cluster of high-ranking guests about Elisa's desperate financial state. Her words were meant for a small circle, but in the heavy silence left by the Marquis's accusation, they carried farther than she intended. I caught Elisa's face from across the room, the way her color drained, the tremor in her hands as she clutched her wineglass. Whispers erupted again, this time aimed squarely at her. She rose from her seat, muttering something about lies, but the glances that met her were full of pity and disdain. She fled the hall without finishing her wine. And then came the final, deliberate strike. I had timed it to perfection. Henry, already trying to defend himself from the Marquis, motioned for Rose to fetch the ledger from his study to prove some point about the treasury's accuracy. She swept from the hall with her chin high, still clinging to her composure. I followed quietly, unseen in the swirl of servants moving in and out of the great hall. When she entered the study and saw the ledger lying open on the desk, she froze. Her hand hovered above it, and I could see in the flicker of her eyes that she knew exactly what it was. But before she could close it, Victor appeared in the doorway with 2 other nobles in tow. "What's this?" he asked lightly, though his tone carried the sharp edge of a trap snapping shut. He moved past her and picked up the book, flipping to the marked page. The forged entries with my name stared back at him. "Strange," he mused, loud enough for the men beside him to hear, "these numbers don't match the Duke's records. Almost as if someone here falsified them to frame an innocent." Rose tried to speak, but her voice caught, and in that hesitation, the nobles had already drawn their conclusions. Victor didn't need to say her name, her silence was enough. Word traveled faster than the cold draft seeping in from the open window. By the time Rose returned to the hall, the looks she received were different now, calculating, cold, dismissive. Henry was too occupied with his own crisis to notice her slipping into the shadows at the edge of the room. I stayed at my post, a servant among the glittering elite, watching the empire that had crushed me in my first life begin to crack in my second. Elise had vanished, Rose's name was now whispered with suspicion, and Henry's authority had been pierced in front of his peers. And none of them knew it was my hand that had guided each blade. As the feast limped toward its end, the guests leaving in tight-lipped pairs, I stepped out into the courtyard. The snow was still falling, thick and silent, coating the stones in a soft white shroud. This was where I had died before, my body frozen and discarded. I stood in the exact spot where I had fallen, the memory sharp in my chest. But now, I was alive, warm, and every person who had once looked down on me was stumbling in the cold I had created. Footsteps approached, and I turned to see Liam standing a few paces away. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a kind of quiet acknowledgement. "It's done, isn't it?" he asked. I let the corner of my mouth curve upward. "It's only the beginning." His gaze flicked back toward the hall, then returned to me. "Whatever comes next, you've made sure they'll never see you as the servant again." I looked past him, up at the towering palace windows glowing faintly with candlelight, and felt the truth of it settle over me like a second skin. They had killed me once, but I had returned with every secret they thought was buried. And in this life, I wasn't just surviving. I was the one writing their endings. The snow kept falling, but I no longer feared the cold. It belonged to me now.